Can the search for profits be infallible? Or rather, does there exist a socio-economic system that is incapable of doing wrong? For the capitalist, can their system flourish without inhumane forms of exploitation? And for the communist, can their communally shared society be possible without sacrificing human rights in economic output? To answer that question, we need to know exactly what these ideas are in terms of practice and definition. What is communism? Communism is a political or economic philosophy founded by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels at the end of the 19th century. And these two individuals are responsible for writing the Communist Manifesto, which, in the philosophy in itself, states that all means of production should be controlled by the state so that the working class or the proletariat could not be exploited. So, why did Marx and Engels care about the proletariat in the first place? Well, first, private employers require physical labor. The working class must work at the behest of their employer, which were also known as a bourgeoisie. The only commodity that the proletariat even could offer was their physical labor in exchange for wages. So while the employer was getting richer, the working class was getting poorer and poorer and subsequently more and more exploited. And as for what exploitation could possibly be, they include poor working conditions, low and unlivable wages, forced labor, child labor, and environmental degradation. And so Marx predicted that this would ultimately lead to class consciousness, or in other words, an awareness of where one fits socially. He believed that the larger the gap was between the working class and the upper class, the more disdain and anger that the working class would have. In other words, the working class would be increasingly more upset if they are getting poorer while the rich are getting richer. In theory, this would result into a revolution, which, unsurprisingly, is exactly what happened during the Bolshevik Revolution that birthed the Soviet Union and instilled Vladimir Lenin as their leader. This was also the case for the Mongolian Revolution in 1921, the Bulgarian coup d'etat in 1944, and the August Revolution in 1945 with regards to Vietnam. So there needs to be an important distinction here. What Karl Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto, this was a goal. It wasn't a roadmap. So he wanted a stateless, classless society where currency or private property does not exist. Yet these characteristics were still never seen during the subsequent interpretations of communism seen by the Soviet Union, Cuba, or virtually any other communist state that had ever existed. And so this is where the word communism is separate from the term true communism. And true communism is typically never discussed since there's no example of it happening that can even be referred to. And this makes even more sense to why this distinction exists, due to the fact that Karl Marx himself was never able to live up to the moment to see communism actually practiced. Now, what is capitalism? Capitalism is a political and economic system with roots extending all the way back to the 16th century. The more modern definition of capitalism seems to be more associated with the societal and political or even economic effects that came about during the Industrial Revolution. And so it is a system in which the ownership and distribution of goods and services are determined by the principles of private property rights. And so to facilitate this distribution of goods and services, there needs to be a market. A market is a place where buyers and sellers can exchange goods and services through something called transaction. And there are many types of markets, such as, but not limited to, the housing market, the labor market, the stock market, etc. So all these types of markets fall under a concept called market economy, which is just an umbrella term for markets where prices of goods and services are determined by supply and demand. And keep in mind that the goal for a market isn't to, in and of itself, create profit. Rather, it's to facilitate transactions so that profits can be made for those individuals. And what do we mean when we say supply and demand? What we are referring to is a system that determines how much of a good or service is available, its supply, and how much people want to buy those goods or services, which are named demand. This shows a relationship between supply and demand. When the quantity of some supplyable commodity, such as a product, a service, or labor, is higher, you notice that demand is going to decrease. And when demand decreases, this shows that price will fall along with it. Take diamonds, for example. We know that diamonds are already low in supplyable quantity. And when something is low in supplyable quantity, we know that the demand is going to be much higher. And when the demand is higher, the price is going to be higher as well. Now, why do capitalists emphasize private ownership in markets so much? They believe it stimulates competition by incentivizing all facets of a market, such as the demand for lower prices, better wages for their workers, better working conditions for their workers, better products, or anything else that the consumer or worker desires. And it's also believed that it increases efficiency by relying on types of work that are repetitive and industrialized, which in turn results in a more innovative, effective, and productive society. When it comes to that repetition, from the capitalist point of view, it's because they appeal to a exploitative culture which states that the growth of management in a company, innovation in production, and efficiency in both the organization and production can all be streamlined if a task is repeated over and over again. Whereas for the communists, they appeal to a more creative and explorative society, where exploration and creativity is held at a higher praise than repetition of a task. Now, it's important to not get confused here. Capitalists are not saying that creativity shouldn't exist at all. As a matter of fact, innovation necessitates and requires creativity. The real issue is that creativity is seen as a supplement to the economy and not the main drive for innovation. They believe that explorative ideas or creative ideas comes in small bursts and helps steer the type of innovation that society deems important in a capitalist society. Now, before wrapping this up and suggesting some kind of common ground or a compromise, I want to thoroughly run through their most fundamental differences. Firstly, in capitalism, private enterprise is necessary, so they are allowed to exist freely. However, in communism, there is no such thing as private enterprise because they want to dissolve the level of influence of private enterprise, thus removing private companies entirely. Additionally, in capitalism, wages are determined by an individual or a CEO, whereas wages in communism are actually centrally determined through a process known as central planning. And it's important to also note that central planning isn't exclusive or unique to determining wages. Matter of fact, quite literally every single aspect of an economy is centrally planned in a communist state. From ownership, from prices of goods, from compensation for failing industries, the types of individuals within a bureaucracy or government, and even the level of freedom by virtue of being communist that the state even allows markets to have. But yet markets can't even exist, so there essentially exists no freedom to escape this planned out economy. And so this plan is usually either recycled or recycled every 5 years, which is a reference to Joseph Stalin's 5-year plan. Now, when it comes to supply and demand in capitalism, the reason why there is a demand for something and there is a reason why there is a subsequent supply to meet those demands is that the value of a specific commodity is interpreted in a very particular way in capitalism. And the main theory that explains this is the marginal utility theory. To understand this concept, we need to understand what the word utility means in the context of economics. All you need to know is that it means happiness and satisfaction. So let's carefully look at the table on the left side first. The first column represents the number of chocolate bars consumed over time. The middle column represents the number of happiness that comes from consuming a chocolate bar. For this, you could choose any number you want since happiness in and of itself is arbitrary and doesn't actually mean any number. You notice how it increases up until it plateaus on the total utility right here, and then it starts to plateau. You'll also notice as it continues to be consumed beyond that plateau, the overall happiness level or the utility begin to actually decrease from 11 to 10 to 10 to 8. You can assume this means that the chocolate bars are beginning to lose their utility after they plateaued, which in turn means they're also beginning to lose value. So what does the third column represent? All it represents is how much utility was gained or lost per consumption. So let's take a look at the second one. You'll notice it has 6 utility points, and going from the second consumption to the third consumption, it jumped from 6 to 8, which means it gained 2 utility points. This will equal the marginal utility for the third consumption. Now check to see what happens when it plateaus. What happens to the marginal utility? Well, the logic continues. Whatever the change was from the first consumption to the next, in this case 11 for the fourth and 11 for the fifth, we could say that these numbers are the same, so there was no marginal gain to them. So the marginal utility for the fifth consumption would equal exactly 0. And so the logic continues even further when you're actually going beneath 0 marginal utility. Going from 10 to 8, we could see that it actually lost 2, so we could say that the seventh consumption is a negative 2 marginal utility. Now take a look at the graph on the right. Keep in mind that this is just a reference and it doesn't actually reflect the chocolate bar situation that I came up with. What you'll notice is that the x-axis represents the quantity of something that was consumed, and this corresponds to the number of chocolate bars consumed. In addition to that, we have the y-axis, which represents the total utility or utils that come about from that consumption, right? And to finish up with this concept, take a look at when the total utility begins to plateau, and then take a look at when it starts to decrease. This point where the utility starts to decrease is called the law of diminishing marginal utility. And so for an economist like myself, this indicator would be seen as a predictive measure for when the specific commodity in question starts to lose its demand, as fewer people find the good worth its price. So again, there needs to be another distinction here. Marginal utility theory is not the sole determining factor for value. Matter of fact, it doesn't determine the innate value of something at all. Rather, it is supposed to explain and describe the fluctuation of demand from within a market. This is because capitalists don't believe that commodities have innate value to begin with, and instead, they believe that the personal evaluation of commodities is subjective, and it's actually determined by the subjective theory of value. Just to wrap this idea up, this model is actually pretty consistent with supply and demand. In a practical sense, demand is lost the more something of the same quality is consumed. In order to compensate, competition between various chocolate manufacturers will take advantage of this loss and create something better or more competitive than the original chocolate bar. Well then, how does a communist determine value? According to Karl Marx, value of a commodity comes from the socially acceptable labor time required to produce that commodity. In this model, it is also believed that value is objective and that it isn't a fluctuating thing across a market like it is in capitalism. And also, believe it or not, it was originally a capitalist belief by classical economists David Ricardo and Adam Smith. And all Marx did was heavily critique their version of it, and then he proposed his own view and named it labor theory. And so how does a classical interpretation differ from Marx's version? Well, we know labor is the source of value, so we could say both of them agree on that. But the difference really does lie in what happens with surplus value. And so quickly, surplus value refers to the excess in value that labor creates once it surpasses the socially acceptable time to complete that labor. So just to demonstrate this, take a look at the gray bar. Imagine a task is given and it takes exactly 12 hours to finish up the entire task. 7 of those 12 hours represents the work that is considered appropriate enough to fulfill the worker's needs, or the necessary labor. But given that they are obligated to work the additional 5 hours, it then becomes an excess of labor, which is also called the surplus in labor. In this example, the money produced from the surplus in labor will not contribute to the wages of the worker in the same way that the necessary amount of labor will. So as value is produced from both, the money goes directly to the employer, which then gets sent to the worker through a wage. And however much the wage ends up being is completely dependent on the employer. Because remember, the employer needs to make profits for their private company. Everything is up to them. And so Karl Marx believed that when the labor exceeds what it should be, the profit that becomes the excess results in surplus value. He thought that under capitalism, if the surplus value all went to the employer and not to the worker providing the labor, then they were actually being exploited. So what now? We know that value is determined differently. We know that wages are given out differently. We know that ownership and freedom greatly differ. We know that exploitation is the main point of contention between both views. But what exactly is a compromise here? What do we do now? So on this spectrum, we could clearly see there's like a gradient of some sort. For some, this might beg the question of whether you actually need to be either communist or fully capitalist. Surely there's got to be like a middle ground of some sort. Like, I don't know, maybe a. Oh, that's really convenient. What a mixed economy is essentially a state or a society that incorporates regulation but not full control. It incorporates the freedom to determine wage but establishes a minimum wage. And it allows for freedom of ownership, but yet it limits the amount of residual income in the form of taxation. So all of these sound familiar because America itself is by and large a mixed economy. The following provisions of a mixed economy include social welfare, such as Medicaid, tax credit policies that balance out the wealth disparity, social security that provides income to the retired. And so, in principle, it balances freedom and fair regulation while managing inequality. It is collaborative by joining together both schools of thought, and it is fair in its allocation of resources by catering to those who seek profit and to those who want to avoid exploitation, all of which can be streamlined to appeal to communistic and capitalistic virtues. To finish up this presentation, I want to conclude with the following excerpt from my paper. In conclusion, both economic systems have vastly different approaches to economic security. For the communist, their interest lies in the public domain where the economy is centrally commanded and all things are shared equally amongst the state's constituents. For the capitalist, the market for ideas and innovation begins and ends in the private sector, where profits are what determine favorable outcomes for society. It is their differing interpretations of wealth, ownership, and freedom that make these two systems far from similar in terms of practice. And since both systems lie in the extreme, there won't be a world where they can coexist. However, there is potential for a mixed economy that extracts the principles that brought the Bolsheviks away from Nicholas Tsar's autocracy and into a thriving society, as well as the innovative drive that moved capitalist countries away from feudalism. Lastly, the distribution and profit-driven characteristics of a capitalist system do currently exist, and they function as a perfect example of how this type of synergy can revolutionize the output of an economy. Given the circumstance and given the context, how can a person believe one is inherently bad or that one is infallible over the other?